The ABC has disgraced itself by running commentary that defends Hamas's use of civilians as human shields and repeats a claim that it's already apologised for, that there's no evidence for. It repeats the claim that children weren't beheaded. This is a shocking new low for the ABC, and the public broadcaster will surely have to apologise for this. Here's what happened. First, the Israeli ambassador, Amir Maimon, gave a calm and thoughtful address to the National Press Club yesterday. After his speech, one ABC journalist asked this appalling question.
You've said in your speech today that Israel does not want to kill the Palestinian people and poses no threat to them. Don't these comments contradict your statement and instead demonstrate the Israeli government's blatant disregard for Palestinian civilians? You're speaking about defence there, and we've heard that being said for the past 2 weeks, that notion that Israel has a right to defend itself. But what does that actually look like? Where is the line crossed? What number of Palestinian people killed is a satisfactory number for the Israeli government? And considering there are more than 5,000, including children, that have been killed, where is that line drawn?
If that wasn't disgraceful enough, it was about to get even worse. Right after the ambassador's address, ABC News 24 brought in its former Middle East correspondent, Nicole Johnston, for analysis. She then denied that Hamas's use of innocent civilians as human shields was happening. She says, where else can they fire their rockets from? Well, how about not firing rockets at all? Have a look at what she had to say.
Hamas accusing it of using human shields. That's a really interesting one. I covered the 2012 war and the 2014 war, and that accusation was constantly made, and we never found it to be correct. It is true, though, that Hamas, Islamic Jihad and these other groups do fire rockets from all over Gaza, behind schools, behind mosques. Well, you have to remember, of course, that Gaza is only 40 kilometres long, 7 to 12 kilometres wide, with 2.5 million people packed inside there. You can't fire a rocket from anywhere in Gaza that's not near civilian infrastructure.
Did you hear what she just said? You can't fire a rocket from anywhere in Gaza that's not near civilian infrastructure. This is beyond disgraceful. Where else can you fire a rocket from? Well, how about you don't fire a rocket at all? How about you don't kill Jews at all? How can the ABC have broadcast this? How can the host not have challenged Nicole Johnston's remarks? Now, you know that the ABC has had to pull its reporter, Tom Joyner, from Israel because he said the claim that Hamas had beheaded babies was BS. But even after this disciplinary action, even after the head of the ABC was questioned and grilled about this at Senate estimates, Nicole Johnston on the ABC, their former Middle East correspondent, brought in as an analyst, backed his position in. She was asked specifically about the atrocities in Israel, and instead of speaking about the shocking acts of terror, she instead said there was no evidence that Hamas had beheaded babies. Have a look.
Some people would come out and say that the issue of dozens of Israeli children being decapitated still hasn't been verified. That came out a couple of weeks ago. It's sort of lit a fire through the media. The Israeli Defense Forces rolled back on it, and I believe we still haven't seen sort of solid evidence of the widespread decapitation. So I think we need to be a little bit careful with that one there. Okay.
No solid evidence of the widespread decapitation of babies. Right. Again, no pushback from the ABC host who was interviewing her at all. As I said, this is the ABC's former Middle East correspondent who they brought on for analysis right after the Israeli ambassador's address to the press club. Now, she's not denying that babies were beheaded. She's saying no widespread decapitation of babies. So what about how babies were burnt to death, how they were gunned down? We have seen these images. Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted them out. Babies. As I said, this is a shocking new low for our public broadcaster that's taxpayer funded. I have never seen such highly offensive coverage in my life. She then goes on to claim that Hamas actually doesn't want to destroy Israel. Oh, we all must have been mistaken by their intentions when they invaded Israel on October 7 and brutally murdered 1,400 Jews.
There are some analysts who would argue that Hamas later reviewed its charter, and when it reviewed its charter, it said that it would accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 lines, and that was considered by many to be a sort of implicit recognition of Israel.
Yep, so despite these terror attacks, according to Nicole Johnston, actually Hamas is fine with Israel existing. What nonsense. She then went on to support the inflammatory remarks from the United Nations chief Antonio Guterres. Now, listen to her saying that Guterres had pointed out that the October 7 attacks didn't happen in isolation. She then goes on to say that his remarks are very important.
We've had the United Nations Secretary General come out with this very strong language, calling it the collective punishment of Gaza. That sort of language Israel will not be happy about. They've already called, I think, for his resignation. He called for a ceasefire, and he also pointed out that this escalation and this attack has not happened in isolation. There is still a 50-year-long occupation of the Palestinian territories, as we heard in that address, an unresolved two-state solution, a lot of issues, a lot of backstory. So I think that was an important point by the United Nations today.
An important point by the UN. As you know, Israel has called for the UN chief's resignation over these remarks that provide a justification for terror. And again, there was no pushback from the ABC host who was interviewing her. The ABC followed up this interview by then bringing in the head of the General Delegation of Palestine, who wouldn't even condemn the Hamas terror attacks.
It just, didn't send any message of peace, did not mention at all the Israeli occupation, colonization, settlements, incursions, persecution of Palestinian people, and the Israel responsible of, what happened in Nakba, what happened in 1967 for the Palestinian people, and the Israeli occupation, and the blockade of Gaza Strip for 16 years. It's a collective punishment. It's a very clear violation of the human rights.
I'm exasperated, offended, depressed and disgusted by the ABC's coverage, particularly after the Israeli ambassador's calm, poised and thoughtful address, where he said he didn't expect everyone to like Israel, and he said he hoped Palestinians and Israelis could live in peace side by side after Hamas's defeat. His message was of hope and peace. Now, it also seems that support for Israel from the Labor government is slipping away as well. Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong keep speaking about bringing home the 79 Australians in Gaza. Officials in Senate estimates clarified today that they were 79 citizens, permanent residents, or family members of Australians who remained in Gaza. And they said that there were intense diplomatic efforts to try and get Egypt to allow their safe passage. Now, last night on this program, I questioned what security checks the government was doing to make sure that none of these people have Hamas affiliations. It's a point that radio host Ray Hadley raised with opposition leader Peter Dutton today.
The government would need to be very wary about bringing people out of a very difficult war-torn environment at the moment. Ultimately, the Prime Minister's got to act in our country's best interests, and I don't believe it's in our country's best interests to be increasing that intake at the moment without certainty around who individuals are.
So Peter Dutton saying very clearly that we need to be careful before bringing home people from Gaza, that security checks need to be done to ensure we aren't importing terrorism from the front line, from Hamas into Australia. We've already seen terrifying scenes of people shouting, "Gas the Jews" at the Opera House. Ray Hadley this morning also spoke about Anthony Albanese's past comments criticising Israel, including from one interview in 2014.
But Albanese, Labor's transport spokesman back in 2014 and left-wing factional leader, and one-time leader contender, used a breakfast TV appearance to point the finger at Israel. What we saw this week, the bombing of a school where people essentially had gone to seek refuge, is unacceptable. Unacceptable for Hamas to fire rockets into Israel, but the collective punishment is against all the rules of engagement, and Israel must stop these actions. At the moment, we're seeing a child killed every hour in Gaza. No mention of how many children may have been killed at the time in Israel. And that's always the case.
So Ray Hadley there reading out an article from 2014 where Anthony Albanese was criticising Israel. And this follows the footage I showed you last night of Albanese attending a pro-Palestinian rally when he was younger and shouting into the megaphone.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
Now, this isn't only a position that Albanese held when he was young. Throughout his parliamentary career, Albanese has been anti-Israel. I'm going to show you now some clips of Albanese attacking Israel over the past 20 years up until 2018, and you can see the dates are on them.
Those people who have guns on one side and on the other side has rocks.
While many Israelis continue to demonise all Palestinians as terrorists, Palestinians experience Israelis as occupiers and employers of cheap labour, interrogators and jailers. Meanwhile, the government of Israel continues to allow fundamentalists to build illegal settlements on Palestinian land. That it is now more than 35 years since UN Security Council Resolution 242 was carried. Since that time, the systematic repression of the occupied by the occupiers has been at the core. The Palestinians must be given their homeland. The occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem by the Israelis has created generations of oppressed people. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and subsequent events have produced up to 3.8 million Palestinian refugees today. It is unfortunate that it was Israel who first funded Hamas.
That wasn't true. That claim that Israel first funded Hamas, that is not true. Now, you can clearly see where Albanese's heart lies. Perhaps it's this history, along with his government's foreign policy on Israel, that explains why Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't rushed to return Albanese's phone call from 10 days ago. Albanese's long-held sympathy with the Palestinian cause explains why he didn't instinctively support French President Emmanuel Macron's call for an international coalition to fight Hamas. Instead, Albanese spoke about humanitarian aid to Gaza. The truth is, in the wake of the September 11 attacks, there were no calls on the United States to have a ceasefire and not to destroy al-Qaeda. In the wake of ISIS, there were no calls on the coalition to stop its fight against this terror. We're only seeing these calls now that it's Israel and the Jewish people who are the targets. Now, it's because of this attitude that we're seeing in the media and in the government that I feel the need to revisit the atrocities from October 7. They are, in reality, far worse than any of us realise. Israeli police have given me unseen footage that was filmed by Hamas as they slaughtered Israelis. Because we are seeing this downplaying of the attacks, as you heard from the ABC's analyst, she didn't talk about the atrocities and instead immediately questioned whether babies were beheaded. Now, the horrors inflicted are not on the same scale as the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews died, and other minority groups as well, but they are as cruel and as barbaric, and this point needs to be made. Now, this is all unseen footage. It is so graphic that I can only play you one clip of the actual footage, but I'm going to describe and talk you through what's in some of it. If there are children in the room, it is distressing, so please mute the television. In one video, too graphic, too obscene to show you, I can only describe to you the horrors it contains. These descriptions will be too distressing for some. It can only be called an execution room. Hamas terrorists shout and celebrate as the camera reveals a small bedroom, and it contains the bodies of 6 or 7 people, presumably from one family. Their bodies are lying mangled and twisted. The walls, the floors, the bedding, covered in blood. The victims' bodies show bullet wounds. And as the camera films, the gunman fires into the bodies again and again, just to make sure. It is depravity on an unimaginable scale. In other images, 2 Israeli soldiers lie on the ground, decapitated. In another video, questions over the fate of what happened to some of the hostages are cruelly answered. A bewildered and terrified man is filmed half naked, his face bruised and bloodied from beatings. And in one haunting moment, he stares into the camera. His eyes are wide open, stunned in absolute terror. The camera then pans to the left, and you see another male hostage lying next to him as a cord is tightened around his neck. The camera then pans to the right. A young man is holding his hands out, pleading for mercy. 2 more hostages then, trapped in the darkened room, awaiting their fate. And all the while, there's triumphant music blaring. For the terrorists, the debasing of another human being, a reason to celebrate. There is only one video that we actually can show you, and a warning, even this is distressing. It starts with Hamas gunmen on foot and in trucks hunting their prey. Their next victims are spotted. One gunman calls out, ammo. Have a listen. What happens next? A slaughter. These are acts of brutality we must never forget, and certainly not just 2 weeks on, nearly 3 weeks on, from October 7. The world is trying to downplay what happened. Our media is trying to downplay what happened when it is truly appalling, barbaric, unimaginable, and more brutal than anyone could truly imagine without seeing the footage that is simply too graphic to broadcast on television. Now, amid all of this horror, I want to end tonight on something that we can focus on that is positive. While there is clearly an absence of leadership in Australia when it comes to anti-Semitism and support for Israel, there is strong support for Israel in the United States. The US has finally got a Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and the first measure to come to the floor, a resolution in support of Israel against Hamas. And it had overwhelming support, 412 votes yes to just 10 voting no. Among the 10 who voted no, 9 were Democrats and 1 was a Republican. The Democrats included Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
The fact that this is the most bipartisan resolution in modern history, with 425 co-sponsors over 97% of this body speaks volumes.